Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we have the case of Antonio Barbeau and Nathan Papp. Up there on the screen, you can see the rest of my cases. Down here are my social media accounts in case you want to follow me on any of them. And without further ado, let's get started. Today's case takes place in Sheboygan Falls in the United States, specifically in the year 2012. In this city lived two teenagers who would be the main characters in today's story. They were Antonio Barbeau, nicknamed Tino, and Nathan Papp, also called Nate, both 13 years old. Antonio was an only child from a low-income family and lived at home with his mother, who raised him on her own and worked, so the young boy spent a lot of time without adult supervision. He was a pretty troubled kid and was passionate about doing anything that was against the law. Before all this, it seems that Antonio was very good at sports and liked to play, but when he was 11 years old, he had an accident while riding his bike. A car hit him and he ended up falling on top of it. Keep this detail in mind because it will be important later during the trial. This injury resulted in 2 years of treatment and not being able to play sports again. It was right after this that he met and started hanging out with Nathan. Nate was a pretty impressionable kid and would go along with everything Tino did. Obviously, for Tino's family, he was the one who fell under Nathan's influence, and for Nate's family, it was the other way around. Anyway, together, they started stealing small things. If someone had some cash lying around the house or a small item like a vape, they would take it. And it didn't matter what anyone did to try to change these behaviors. The kids just didn't want to follow the rules. They were really close friends and spent most of their time together. At that time, the area had very low crime rates. In fact, crime was almost non-existent. That's why so many people chose to live there, since it was very peaceful and the people in the neighborhood felt really comfortable. At least until September 17th, 2012, the day these young men decided to change everything. That day, Nathan asked his mother to drive him and Antonio to Barbara's house, who was 78 years old and Antonio's great-grandmother. She was also a volunteer driver for elderly people in Sheboygan Falls. She spent a lot of time in the garden, and those who knew her described her as a peaceful and positive person. Going back to the day of the events, the young men heading to the elderly woman's house were actually going for a visit, and they definitely didn't have good intentions, though you might have guessed that. In their backpacks, they hidden things that people don't usually carry around for no reason, especially not when visiting a family member's house. They had a hammer and an axe in their backpacks. Without knowing it, that day Nathan's mother had led them to commit the terrible crime that would change not only their lives, but also Barbara's and many others. When they arrived, they tried to get into Barbara's house through the garage, but the woman saw them and innocently invited them in, even asking if they were there because they were cold. That's how the young men took advantage of the opportunity, and as soon as Barbara turned her back, they hit her with the blunt side of the axe, then with the hammer, and finally with the blade of the axe, driving it so deep into her skull that, according to Stephen Riffle, the police chief, they literally had to use force to get the murder weapon out. The young men's original plan was to dump Barbara's body in a forest near the house, but it was clearly more difficult than they expected. Let's remember, they were only 13 years old. Even with two of them, it was a pretty complicated feat, so they only managed to move her to the garage. Before leaving the scene, the teenagers started searching for what was the motive for the crime: the money. But things didn't go as they expected, since the great-grandmother didn't have much, so they were only able to steal $155 in cash and some jewelry. They also came up with an alibi at that moment. The young men took the car that was in the garage and drove it to a bowling alley. There, they left it, along with the jewelry they had stolen from the elderly woman, hoping that someone would see the jewelry, notice the unlocked car, and take it, making that person part of the investigation and pinning the blame on them. Still, none of this worked, and 12 hours later, they were arrested. This happened after blood-stained clothes and shoes were discovered in Antonio's locker. Later, during another investigation at Nathan's house, more blood-stained clothing was discovered, as well as a gold watch that belonged to Barbara and the victim's purse in a nearby storm drain. Barbara used to stop by her daughter Judy's house every morning, and when she didn't show up for 2 days and didn't answer phone calls, her daughter, who lived quite close by, went over to the house. Then she opened the garage door to get to the front door and was met with the worst scene: her mother's body covered in blood with a blanket over her face. Seeing this, she ran out to ask a neighbor to call the police. At first, she thought it had been an accident, but she soon discovered the truth. To begin with, when she entered through the garage, she noticed that the car that was usually there was missing. When she called 911, you could tell she was stressed. She was looking at a scene that was hard for her to explain. She thought maybe her mother had fallen down the stairs, but it was very strange that there was a piece of cloth over her. How did that even get there anyway? The blood around was clear evidence that something serious had happened. When Judy saw the blanket covering Barbara, it was easier for her to think that maybe Barbara had been walking around the house wrapped in the blanket and had fallen, that it was simply a domestic accident, since she was found in the garage and it was possible she had tripped on those small stairs or that it was too dark. But the reality was clearly something else. During the call to the police, the operator followed the usual procedure for these types of cases, so she asked Judy if her mother was still breathing. To check this, they had to remove the blanket from Barbara's head, and they found something extremely unpleasant. Her head was so crushed that parts were missing, or at the very least couldn't be distinguished. On the other hand, the upper part of her head had almost disappeared. At first, the detective had nothing. Seeing that Barbara was an elderly woman loved by everyone, she wasn't the kind of person who had enemies. But after conversations with Barbara's family and many images taken from surveillance cameras in places near the area, they quickly identified the two 13-year-old boys. Still, seeing them near the house didn't mean they were the culprits. After all, would anyone really believe that two 13-year-olds would do something like that? Well, it's obviously possible and has happened before. It was hard to believe considering their ages and the low crime rate in the area. So they wanted to talk to them to see what they knew. Up until that point, there wasn't a solid hypothesis, although it was believed that even though Barbara didn't have any enemies or anyone who wanted to hurt her, her death could have been someone's way of getting revenge for something a member of her family had done. That's why they had to cover all the bases and ask everyone who knew her if they knew anything about it. Even so, there were several things that linked them to the events. Among them, they left Barbara's car very close to Nathan's house. Antonio's parents had already mentioned that this guy was being a bad influence on him. Antonio was interrogated, and in the recordings, you could see how his body spoke for him. His body language gave away that he was quite nervous and stressed. He couldn't stop touching his face, yawning, scratching himself, and covering his eyes. The young man said that the last time he had seen his great-grandmother was about 2 months ago. Also, his answers were vague and unclear. When he was asked where he was on the day of the incident, Antonio, after thinking for a few minutes, replied, "I'm pretty sure I stayed at a friend's house that night." But in reality, he didn't show any confidence in his answers. To which the detective said, "Well, today is Thursday. It wasn't that long ago. So do you know which friend you stayed with on Monday night?" Antonio replied that he had probably stayed with Nathan Papp. The detectives told Antonio that they would give him one last chance to tell the truth and to think carefully about it. So after thinking it over, he ended up telling another story in which supposedly it was his friend who had started the attack against Barbara. What the young man didn't know at that moment was that the detectives had already had an extensive conversation with him about what had happened that Monday, during which he gave a completely different version, which led to the question of which of the two was lying. Mainly to also find out what each one was involved in. During Nathan's interrogation, he was asked if Antonio was seeing anyone else, to which he replied that Antonio used to hang out with a guy named Nick, but ever since Nick's parents installed cameras and discovered that Antonio had broken into their house more than once and stolen money, they were no longer friends. Nick's family then called the police, and for this reason, Antonio had been staying at a shelter in the days leading up to the crime, which is a place that provides a home both for juvenile offenders and for children who temporarily need services. He was supposed to stay there for about 2 weeks, but on Friday afternoon, after school, he ran away and went to Nathan's house, where he stayed until Monday, the day he supposedly stayed watching TV at his friend's house because Nathan had gone to school. In the interrogation, Antonio also stated that while Nate's mom was at work, he had gone out for a drive in her car, which once again showed his disregard for rules and the safety of others. This pattern in Antonio's behavior, such as breaking into private property or not following the rules, is a possible conduct disorder and can be a precursor to antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. Children with conduct disorder display behaviors such as aggression toward people and animals, destruction of property, deceit or theft, and frequent rule violations. For his part, Nathan had been quite evasive and didn't mention his involvement at Nick's house until he was asked how he knew about it, and then he confessed that he had been there with him on those occasions. Nathan was also caught stealing, but the punishment given to Nate was completely different from Antonio's. They weren't supposed to be together, so they decided to send Nathan home with his parents, with his family. Although, as I already mentioned, this didn't do much good since Antonio stayed at his friend's house and they kept seeing each other as usual. It wasn't the first time the boys had done things like this, and possibly with the combination of their personalities, all of this was amplified. That meant that most likely, without the right intervention, this would have continued and gotten worse. On the other hand, something quite peculiar was that after an hour of questioning, Nathan hadn't even asked why he was there, and his mother hadn't asked to speak to a lawyer or tried any other way to protect him, which could be a sign that they were already used to dealing with these issues because of his past behavior. In the end, both boys ended up confessing. During the interrogation, Nathan asked for a piece of paper, on which he later wrote down his admission of involvement in the crime because he was too embarrassed to say it in front of his mother, who was with him that day. He then ended up confessing everything through tears, although he was clearly very stressed and could barely speak. On the other hand, Antonio also admitted his involvement in the crime, although he didn't show any emotion, not even when he was first told that Barbara was dead. He simply froze and didn't say much more. But it was pretty clear that neither of the boys was fully aware of the consequences of their actions. His great-aunt had said that Nathan thought he would go back home after admitting to the murder. Clearly, he didn't understand the seriousness of what he had done. Also, according to what the accused said, on the day of the crime, they were dropped off at the roundabout at 42 and 28, which meant the boys had to walk to Barbara's house and had at least half an hour to reconsider what they were about to do. Finally, the day after the crime, they got up, skipped school, and went to buy pizza with the money they had stolen from Barbara. The $155, which wasn't much, they used on things like that. On August 12, 2013, Nathan and Antonio were tried as adults for first-degree murder. That year, Antonio pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. During the trial, his defense attorney argued that in 2009, Antonio had been involved in a car accident that left him with an unspecified cognitive disorder, which could have influenced his behavior. What Antonio's lawyers and family were trying to do was keep justifying his crime with a brain injury. Do you remember I told you about an accident he had on his bicycle? Well, his defense tried to argue that from that moment on, his development had been different. This, as some of you may know, isn't new in cases involving killers. Yes, there are studies that try to explain the relationship between serious head injuries during childhood and the behavior of some serial killers, like Petiso Orejudo or the Night Stalker, among many others. For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, I could give a brief explanation. It's pretty common to find stories of childhood abuse in the early lives of the most notorious serial killers, whether the abuse came from parents, siblings, or someone else in the family. It's abuse that lasts for years, and many times we also find strong religious beliefs that push to the extreme what they later do to their victims or how they behave. While these experiences make up a good percentage of the backgrounds of this type of criminal, it's not exclusive. They don't necessarily have to have suffered a great deal of abuse to end up killing other people. One of the most well-known examples of this is Jeffrey Dahmer, who, although he did hate his mother and his father wasn't very attentive to him, didn't suffer the physical harm we see in other childhoods. So we can see that it's not so easy to predict who will become a killer in the future. In the same way, we can't say that everyone who hits their head before adolescence will develop homicidal tendencies. But we've come to notice that this coincidence appears in several serial killers. One of the most well-known studies on this topic is the one on neurodevelopmental and psychosocial risk factors in serial killers and mass murderers. The conclusions drawn from this study were, broadly speaking, and without going into detail, considering that 239 American killers were chosen, the following. Among the 239 eligible killers, 28.03% had ASD defined as highly probable or possible. In other words, it was possible that they were on the autism spectrum. Among the 239 eligible killers, 21.34% had a definite or suspected head injury. Of the 106 killers who remained with ASD and/or head injury, 55% had experienced psychosocial stress factors. Clearly, and I have to repeat this, none of these things means that just because someone is on the autism spectrum or has suffered a head injury, they are going to become killers. Rather, we should look at the third piece of data with great interest, since this tells us that abuse, along with other characteristics and the lack of treatment, can lead to violent behavior. But this is just one study, and science requires constant research. It is undeniable, nonetheless, that there are several killers who suffered serious head injuries during their childhoods. However, all this explanation is usually not enough to convince a jury. Likewise, this head injury could actually mean that at some point, Antonio lost that connection with other people that he had when playing sports. He might have felt excluded and fallen back into this friendship with Nathan, leading him to do terrible things. And at the same time, Nathan's defense was doing the same thing. They argued that the young man had developmental problems. However, nothing was enough to justify what had happened. 2 weeks later, Nathan also pleaded not guilty. Later, Antonio changed his plea to guilty as part of a deal with the state that would make him eligible for parole in 35 years. Later, it would be Nathan's turn, who would face a jury of 11 men and 3 women. The statements began on July 17, 2013, and his defense attorney, Chris Petros, told the jury that on that September afternoon, Nathan had come home from school as usual. Minutes later, his friend Antonio showed up at the door and after pulling out an axe, suggested the idea of killing his own great-grandmother. At the time of the incident, Nathan had accompanied him and was watching the scene in a state of shock. According to this version, Nathan was just a bystander. On the other hand, Antonio gave a different account. While he admitted that he had attacked Barbara with the axe, he said that his friend Nathan had also struck Barbara with a hammer. After this, Nathan took the stand and confessed to hitting Barbara twice with the hammer, and, according to the defendant's words, said he only did it because he was afraid Antonio would attack him next. He also said that Antonio had a blank stare, with no emotion on his face, as he kept hitting Barbara. He even said that the young man, at the moment of the crime, had taken off his shirt so it wouldn't bother him while he was killing his great-grandmother. The Fond du Lac County medical examiner testified that Barbara had been struck at least 27 times with sharp and blunt objects. As for the $155 stolen that same day, it was discovered that the money had been spent on marijuana and pizza. They spent $10 on marijuana and the rest on pizza. That's what Barbara's life was worth to Mount. Clearly, all of this proved the involvement of both young people in the murder, who had also planned everything together. At one point during the hearing, photos of Barbara were shown on the screen, and the entire room felt completely silent. With the deep wounds she had on her head, face, arms, and hands, it was clear that she had tried to defend herself, which meant that she might have even been aware that it was her own grandson who was attacking her. Antonio stated in court, "I know I don't show my emotions. I'm not even sure why myself. I took the life of someone's mother, grandmother, sister, friend. I had no right to do it. Because of this action I decided to take, I ruined so many lives." Antonio's grandmother and the victim's daughter stated that her mother would have wanted Antonio not to receive a harsh punishment so that he could have the chance to become a good person. What Antonio's lawyers and family were trying to do was to keep justifying his crime with a brain trauma, while at the same time, Nathan's defense was trying to do the same, arguing that he had developmental issues. Despite this, Judge Timothy Van Ackeren did not agree with either defense and argued that it was the worst crime he had faced in his 24 years on the bench. He said, "I have not seen anything of this nature, not even close." As the trial was coming to an end, both teenagers tearfully asked for forgiveness. Obviously, this was not enough to save them from prison, and after a few hours of deliberation, Nathan was found guilty of being part of a first-degree intentional murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 31 years. Antonio was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 35 years. Right now, Antonio is on a pen pal website, which means that if you want to talk to him, you can. He has a brief description of himself and a banner you can click to find out about his conviction. In this case, it would be first-degree intentional homicide. The website in question allows convicts to write their own descriptions. Here's the summary of what Antonio says. "Hi, I hope you stopped by my profile in an attempt to learn and know more about me, because I'm definitely looking to get to know you. Now, why are you here?" Why am I here? While I can't answer for you, I can say that I joined this pen pal program because I've missed the company of people who aren't incarcerated for far too long, and now I'm looking to make as many real-world friends and connections as possible. I'm entering this process with the hope of building lifelong friendships and support networks with people I can connect with over similar interests and ideals. I'm not looking for romantic relationships, since I'm happy with an amazing woman. My interests include a desire to help those who are less fortunate and to build a more just society, a deep passion for animals, and everything related to nature. Simply listening to music and enjoying a good movie, as well as fantasy football, physical activities like hiking, camping, and working out, traveling, reading, and going out with friends to social events. I'm an outgoing person who loves the company of genuine, honest, and affectionate people. I don't know why you'd want to write to him, but this pen pal program is on Wire of Hope, so you can find more information about it there. Writing to inmates on that site is actually, in fact, pretty easy. When Nathan and Antonio turn 49, both of them will be able to apply for parole and a second chance at life, something that Barbara will clearly never be able to do. So that's all for today. That's where we wrap up this case. Let me know what you think in the comments. Here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those means, and with nothing more to say, here's a new video for you, and here's a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.